Hey, greetings, and welcome to April 15th. And this is going to be a short devotional thought that is going to serve as a bridge between where we've been and where we're going. So, early on, we started with we are story formed people. We've been investigating and looking at our stories, how stories communicate the below the line to the above the line. The below the line is where the meat of our lives is held, the worldviews, values, aspirations, and fears. The above the line is what we see on top, how we behave, our attitudes, our actions, the words we speak. And we've been speaking a lot about how the Christian story in particular ought to be understood in its below the line nature, and then how spiritual formation forms us to live true to our story so that there's a sense of integrity and authenticity as we live from below the line into the above the line. As we move into this above-the-line world, we're moving into the world of ethics. How we live, how ought we to live? And really, ethical discourse is nothing more than asking the question, what is the right, true, good, and noble about how I am to live in this world? And what are my responsibilities to live in regards to the right, good, true, and noble in this world? Now, I think this is important because if we're not careful, there's a disconnect between what we say we believe below the line and how we live above the line. So ethics for me is about the coherence of our story, to ensure that what I say forms me, the substance of my life, the below the line, the worldviews, the values, the aspirations and fear, are translated not only through my story, but into my actions, how I actually live in this world. And I believe that this is one of the greatest threats the Christian church faces. And I think you did an apt job of pointing that out in your 21st century reflections. Over and over again, I heard you say in your 21st century reflections, one of the biggest threats that faces the church is that our actions aren't always consistent with what we say we believe. And for me, ethical discourse is about having meaningful conversations about the kinds of ethical topics to ensure that how we live is coherent with what we say we believe. And I think, again, for the church, this is what is at stake. Now, there's a lot of talk currently about this pandemic crisis and about how it could be the motivating factor for lots of people coming back to faith. Possibly, maybe. It has not been my experience, and I don't even think necessarily the experience historically, that theodicy is a great motivator for people coming back to faith. And what I mean by that, remember we talked about theodicy being the problem with good and evil? Many who suffer greatly at the hands of this pandemic won't necessarily look at that as a blessing from God or this motivation to come back from God. And so I think the suggestion that we're going to end up in some big revival as a result of this crisis, maybe I hope for it, I just don't know that it's going to be accurate. I think the greatest motivator for people coming to faith won't necessarily be the pandemic or how it turns people to God. I think it's going to be through the actions of Christians, both now and coming out of the pandemic, that bear witness to the kingdom in meaningful ways. What we talked about in lecture section 4, bear witness to the kingdom in meaningful ways that are compelling. So I once had a conversation, and I may have shared this in class, with someone who said there's basically two ways that people come to faith, either through crisis or being born into it. And I said, man, that's a great idea, great thoughts, but I think there's a third, and for me, it's compelling. Sometimes there's something compelling about what we do that makes people want to ask the kind of questions about the faith that we say we believe in. And if there's a disconnect between what we do and what we believe, people won't be drawn to ask those questions. So if I say I believe in the Christian story, then my actions ought to be conducive to that story. And this is what I want to talk, and this is the devotional that I want to offer in regards to our engagement in conversations about ethics and why ethics matters. Now, there's this letter that John, the beloved disciple of Jesus, writes. It's his first letter, and in the 3rd chapter of his first letter, he says these words. He says, "For this is the message you heard from the beginning, who should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. This is how we know what love is, and I love this. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother and sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and truth. My goodness, there it is. There's the connection that I want us to make. What I want us to understand is that the Christian faith has a sense of core belief, worldviews, values, aspirations, and even fears. But those core assumptions, the below-the-line stuff, doesn't matter unless through our stories and lives, through what we do, it translates into the actions above the line. So for me to say, God is love and I love my neighbor, and yet do nothing about the plight, the struggle, the desperation that my neighbor finds themselves in, is to be a hypocrite. And I believe that one of the most attractive and compelling forces for Christianity is when the church's ethics matches its values, when the church's ethic matches its kingdom commitments. And I think that is substantial in regards to the nature of how we understand our responsibilities to one another and to the faith that we say we believe in. So ethics for me, ethical reflection as a Christian, is the suggestion that I have a responsibility to the world around me to seek out the good, true, right, and noble, and to connect what I believe about the kingdom and what I believe about living into the kingdom through Jesus Christ into the actions that I take, into how I care for, love, make sacrifice for, extend compassion to those who are weary and wounded, broken and battered by life, those who are most vulnerable, those who live on the margins, those who are most peripheral, those who are hurting, those who are mourning, those who are grieving, and then even more broadly, the systemic issues of this world that keep people bound and broken. As I engage those systemic issues, I am embracing the right, good, true, and noble in response to the values that I have. So, let me suggest this. People often suggest that there's some sort of disconnect between evangelism and social justice. And I'm just not convinced that that is the case. And I think we've talked about this. Social justice is, for me, the outgrowth of a life that takes seriously the ethics of the kingdom. Motivated by a kingdom imagination. What we do, how we live, what we pursue, the right, good, true, and noble, what we seek to heal, what we seek to remedy, the differences that we ought to make in the lives of those who are hungry and hurting, all of that matters as a reflection of the good news that I say I believe in. So ethics as a Christian is the coherence of our story. It's to ensure that we don't live hypocritical to our story. That we are not blinded by the stories of this world that seek to steal from us our responsibility to one another. To be our brother's keeper. To be neighbor to one another. And so as we journey through this, for me, there's a lot at stake when we start having conversations about ethical discourse. Because I believe the greatest changes that are going to happen in the lives of those around us who do not know Jesus aren't necessarily going to happen because somebody's theology told them how they should make sense of the suffering that they've struggled through. It's going to be through the hands and feet of Jesus, through us, that people might see the good deeds that we do and see through us, beyond us, to our Father in heaven, from whom they come and for whom we do them. And so the right, good, true, and noble is how we act in response to the story that we say we believe in. We say we love, we ought to feed, we ought to care, we ought to be compassionate, and we ought to be engaged in things that keep people bound, broken, and hurting. There's your thoughts for today.